to all the participants to today's webinar. This is the series of webinars run by the World Bank Institute's E-Institute in collaboration with World Bank Institute's climate change practice. And we welcome you to today's webinar, which is on incubating innovation for rural off-grid electrification. Um, First of all, let me introduce the the team which is behind this project. The climate change is the World Bank Institute's climate change team is implementing a project called Incubating Innovation for Rural Off-Grid Electrification, and this year's current focus is on the telecom energy synergies possible for supporting energy solutions. The webinar series of the Institute is meant to educate and foster discussion around pressing issues in development, such as supporting rural off-grid electrification. The target of these webinars is generally policymakers and practitioners in the specific fields for which today's topic actually has attracted, as we can see already from the list of attendees, several people who have been engaged with this initiative and are working on the subject of rural electrification for several years. The webinar series actually is a fortnightly event which takes place throughout the year. You can see the schedule of events on the website of the Institute. Today's event is specifically uh, by the climate change team on this project on rural off-grid electrification. So thank you for joining us and welcome again. Let me begin by talking a little bit about the initiative itself. Most of you probably are aware a little bit of what the World Bank team, which includes the World Bank Institute, the World Bank Group's energy department and energy teams, and IFC are implementing over the past several months. The initiative is meant to look at innovative solutions, business solutions for supporting off-grid electrification in remote rural areas. We will talk a little bit more about exactly what this initiative is trying to do in a few minutes. Just to introduce the team behind this, my name is Monali Ranade. I am a senior environmental specialist with the World Bank Institute. The other speaker in today's webinar, Ms. Mohua Mukherjee, is a senior energy specialist also at the World Bank. Apart from the two of us, there are a couple of people who are missing who actually were announced as part of speakers of today's webinar, which include Mr. Reinhard Reichel from IFC and other members of the team many of you are corresponding with on a regular basis is Jan Tanves from WBI and Rajendra Singh from the World Bank. There are, of course, several other people in this team who I'm not mentioning right now, but you will have heard from them or are in touch with them, and I welcome you on everyone's behalf. To give you a very quick introduction of what is it that we are trying to do as part of this initiative, we have been asked what do we mean by incubation? What do we mean by innovation? As all of you are experts in the area of grid electrification, I don't need to explain what that means. When we are talking about innovation, we are not necessarily talking about inventing new technologies, which is work that is going on in the private sector and is being led by many of you in many developing countries and rural areas around the world. There are also different financing and financing solutions, different solutions around payment options, around microfinance solutions, around micro technology solutions, which are being invented and innovated at this point around the world. Incubation has many meanings. In this case, this project actually is only trying to focus on first of all, just bringing all of us together around the table to understand what is it that really needs to be done to bring a lot of this excellent innovative work, excellent new thought, new thinking, new approaches that are being piloted and tested and developed practically on a daily basis around the world. So this Incubating Innovation initiative of the World Bank primarily seeks to bring all of us together to a common understanding of what is the challenge that we are trying to address, which basically is how to take innovation to scale, how to identify challenges and their appropriate solutions, which are perhaps appropriate for one village and not appropriate for the neighboring village, let alone a neighboring country. We are trying to do this through a whole series of WBI based platforms and activities. Most of you, or many of you, will have attended the first roundtable, which we held in November of 2012, where we had a very broad range of participation, and we are very grateful to all of you who have continued to be a part of this initiative since that time. Since then, we have also undertaken or supported a market research in Tanzania, which aims to help us understand what kind of community level information needs to be brought out to make that connection between private sector led, profit centered initiative and energy access for the poorest. Finally, we have also initiated the Collaboration for Development platform, the C4D platform as it is called, which is running a practitioner network called Telecom Energy Initiative, of which many of you are members. And this webinar is a part of that ongoing conversation, which we began with the roundtable, are continuing through the platform, and are hoping to continue following this webinar as well. The first e-discussion, which was held on the platform, brought to light a lot of very interesting discussion points, challenges, as well as opportunities while discussing the choices between mini grids and energy service solutions. We invite you to come to the platform to read the interesting discussion that took place during the first e-discussion. And as a follow-up of this webinar, we will also host a second e-discussion to continue the conversation that we have during this webinar. Now, moving on, as a follow-up of what has been discussed already in the past events, today's webinar is trying to put together some of the thinking that has emerged over the discussions that we have had with all of you and other practitioners over the past 4 to 6 months. There is an interesting development towards what is it that we need to do as the World Bank, as the World Bank Institute's project. What is the role that we need to play or that we can potentially play to support innovations and support of grid electrification? Some of the summary of the findings till date and some of the observations that we have gathered are going to be presented by Mohua in a few minutes from now. One of the biggest reasons for doing this initiative and using all of these tools for bringing all of us together, may it be the platform, the roundtable, the conferences that are planned, and so forth, the biggest reason is that all of the ideas, the innovations, the new thinking, the groundbreaking, game changing ideas are all out there among you, with you. What we would like to do is to bring you together so that we can all identify these new solutions, so we can identify methods and ways by which we can help you, we can help ourselves support and grow energy access, achieve the goals of energy access that we have set for ourselves. With this, I would now like to invite Mohua Mukherjee to present to and I will hand over to Mohua now.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm pleased to be here this evening. I'm in Delhi. I'm speaking to you from Delhi. So good morning, good evening, good afternoon to all our participants everywhere. Uh, I'm I'm really happy that so many of you are in the audience today who are practitioners, who are thinking about this, who are very experienced in this subject. So without further ado, I would just like to mention that I'm looking forward most of all to the discussion and Q&A period as soon as we finish making the few points in the slides. And we look forward to an active participation from all of you so that we can enrich the discussion and move forward in terms of thinking about how better to harness all of our efforts. So let me just begin with a structure so that you know um, essentially what I plan to cover in the short time that I will be speaking. I would like to, first of all, spend a very few minutes on um, making sure that we are all talking about a common framework, or we're all thinking about a common framework of why the off-grid space actually has become recently a promising area where small power providers, social entrepreneurs can actually think of getting involved. So we'll just start off with that as the beginning. Then we will talk about the ABC model, where, as we have coined this phrase in the World Bank, and why that may be interesting and why that may help small businesses to get involved in energy access. And then the third question, which is where I would like to spend the most time and also engage your comments and discussions as much as possible, is how external parties that many of us represent, either representing a donor interest, a financing institution, I should say a think tank, a foundation, a challenge grant provider, all of us who are sort of sitting on the sidelines with the intent to help and contribute to the faster growth of energy access, how can we create a better ecosystem in which private energy supply companies or ESCOs can grow? And so essentially, so that you know the scope of what I want to talk about today. Minutes going over just to make sure we have a common starting point on why the off-grid space is attractive for private investment, whereas it's previously always been uh, reserved for donors and public sector renewable energy agencies. So off-grid customers rely on fuel whose cost has been going up. And while the cost of supplying any kind of energy solution on an off-grid basis has been falling, so for the first time now, it's possible to make a commercial case where your customer is prepared to pay a higher price than they were paying before, because that is what they have been doing, and the cost to a private investor to supply a solution has been falling. So there's a net positive margin, and this allows private sector entry. Generally, we observe social entrepreneurs coming in. They are not bearing the full cost of supplying the solution, but just the fact that they enter this space means that private project management capability, private know-how, and focus is coming to supplying solutions with a focus on also customer service. The other important factor, apart from the opposite directions of fuel costs and technology, is the fact that the power consumption of household appliances has drastically dropped. For example, if you look at light bulbs, there was previously something that used to consume 50 watts can give the equivalent light or more for about 6 watts now. Televisions, 300 watts previously, down to 75 watts, and even small refrigerators and coolers that needed an installed power capacity of 600 watts now can run on about 60 watts. So the low power consumption has also allowed people to do much more with much less power. So a small amount of low-cost power supplied commercially can really go a long way to improving the access picture today. So these are the background factors, as I'm sure all of you are familiar with, for why there has been recently private sector entry and interest in the energy access picture. Again, just to quickly run over this energy ladder and how it's been changing. Electrification technologies that are supplied by private providers can range from a few watts for solar lighting and phone charging, standalone PV, to full grid connections, or even, well, that's obviously usually the public sector, or isolated mini grid electrification that can give continuous access to a sufficient amount of power. We're talking about the whole range. However, most small investors or small ESCOs' initial focus is likely to be at the lower wattage end of this scale, getting 1 to 50 watts of electricity to households and providing about 4 to 12 hours of power per day, rather than jumping to the large provision at first. I also should mention that even before this, we also are talking about lanterns, and there is excellent experience of IFC, World Bank, and many others participating in the Lighting Africa initiative, now Lighting Asia. So we are actually talking about the whole gamut, from lanterns, rechargeable lanterns or solar-powered lanterns, to all the way to 24/7 access on an AC grid of 230 volts. But we are seeing private sector interest in this entire spectrum. We expect that in very remote places, places that are far from, let's say, a paved road, we may start on the uh, lower energy supply side to begin with, especially if the household incomes are very low. And we expect what we've said in this last bullet point, that for a private investor, familiarity with the customer base and a gradual increase in customer income and loads will allow for scaling up at a particular location. So now that we have covered essentially what it is we are talking about and why private investors are getting interested and starting to appear, particularly in India, we're seeing a number of business models that private investors are focusing on, and many in the audience can contribute richly to this discussion later. Let me just quickly run through the model that we have thought about, which is essentially to reduce risk for a private investor. So it reduces risks in the off-grid space, and it identifies three sets of customers. They're the anchors, the businesses, and the community members, hence A, B, C. And some of you will wonder, isn't A the same as B? So I want to distinguish between anchors and businesses, and to essentially say that an anchor represents definitely daytime load, which is predictable in nature, and the anchor requires continuous delivery of power. And businesses are local commercial establishments for whom power is a critical input to their business, but their power demand may not be entirely predictable, and it may not be fully continuous, but it's there. I mean, they're definitely, they require power during the daytime. And community members, we would think that for many of them, affordability is a major issue, and their budget may have many other pressing needs in addition to power. So they're quite price sensitive and income sensitive. Let me also mention that the businesses which are consuming power may themselves be subject to other their own issues if they don't have working capital, if their business fortunes fluctuate and so forth. Their load is not as predictable as that of an anchor customer. So they're important, but they're not quite anchor level. And why is it important to have a daytime load? Let's remember that the private investor has invested a certain amount of capital and he is looking for a payback period to be as short as possible. So the way his payback occurs is when he's making revenues by selling power. So that's why daytime load is crucial. If he were to put in a capital investment to only sell for a few hours of power at night, then his revenues would be only a few hours in the day. His capacity utilization would be much lower, and then his payback period would be correspondingly much longer. And he would be less bankable and less investable. So therefore, we need daytime load, and anchors and businesses become extremely important to make the proposition financially viable for a private investor. So, oh dear, this table has become a little crowded, but the question it's asking is, how does the ABC model reduce risk? So let me walk you through this table for a moment. Let's look at the anchor. And for example, we've said one anchor is a telecom tower. As you know, a telecom tower is continuously providing signal to its customers, and therefore it needs power 24/7 at an extremely high reliability, 99.99% uptime. So if we go to the second column, does a telecom tower offer a high margin at the price that it's willing to pay to a small ESCO power supplier? The answer is actually no. The telecom tower is a continuous load, but the telecom tower does not pay a high price to the ESCO because he can squeeze the ESCO on prices. Because the telecom tower is a very large customer, very powerful compared to the size of the ESCO, and he will pay something that is not a high price. But now going over to the next column, does it make the ESCO bankable? If the telecom tower signs a contract to sell power to the ESCO, do commercial banks like to see that? If the ESCO is trying to take a commercial loan from them? Absolutely yes. So having a power supply agreement with a telecom tower is extremely helpful to the ESCO. And as we say in the following column, the conclusion, telecom tower is not profitable, but it's bankable for the ESCO. And the risk mitigation impact is that a power purchase agreement gives the ESCO access to a commercial bank. The commercial bank says, right, if I make you a loan and you are receiving revenues from somebody as creditworthy as a telecom tower, then I believe that you will be in a position to repay my loan. So I think I will make you the loan. Now, going down to the next row, if you look at his next customer category, which are businesses, such as a rice mill or a local shopping center, is that a high margin customer for the ESCO? Yes. Why? It's because it's very expensive for a local business to supply itself with power, manage the fuel logistics, and so forth. So their opportunity cost can be as high as $3.50 per kilowatt hour, as the Tanzania market research has shown. So if they're used to paying such high prices and somebody offers them power for, let's say, $2 per kilowatt hour or $1.50, they would be extremely happy and they would consume a lot more power. So very profitable for the ESCO. Does it make the ESCO bankable, however? If you're able to sign up a local rice mill and supply daytime power to them, the answer is no. Commercial banks wouldn't care if the ESCO lined up a bunch of these customers because the commercial bank itself would not lend to such rice mills and so forth. If you are talking about some shops at the roadside, for example, the commercial bank would say, well, they may be here today, gone tomorrow. Nice for you that it's very profitable, but I'm not going to lend to you based on the portion of your revenue projections that come from these guys. So the PPA with local businesses certainly gives the ESCO high margin, and they are the most profitable customer category for the ESCO, but they will not help to make him bankable. And then we go down to the third category of customers, community members, households in the community. Yes, possibly they could represent high margin customers, or they may not if the household demand is very tiny and very variable, especially if it's on a pay-as-you-go basis. And does it make the ESCO bankable? No, the bank doesn't care whether you have these kinds of customers. The household is neither bankable nor profitable, but it's needed for the buy-in of the local community, and it gives the ESCO roots in the community and helps to protect its assets, reduces security expenses and so forth for the ESCO's assets. So in summary, if a local ESCO is able to get these three categories of customers, it reduces risk, makes the project bankable, and so in addition to crowding in some private sector money from the ESCO, uh, his equity funds and any other investors' equity funds, plus also commercial debt funds, um, it helps to make the project, take the project away from a purely what has been seen previously, which is a purely public sector finance project. So this type of customer segmentation, we believe, helps in reducing risk. Not all, we should add here that not all ESCOs will be able to get a power purchase agreement with a telecom tower, because the telecom tower is naturally extremely cautious about the track record of the ESCO and its dependability to provide the kind of reliable power. So we're using the telecom tower here as the best and most obvious example of an ESCO in a rural area with no grid power. Right now, today, the telecom towers are entirely supplying themselves for the most part. But the idea is if they could be persuaded to buy power from an ESCO, it would certainly help the ESCO to get established and become bankable. There are other anchor customers if an ESCO is unable to succeed in securing an agreement with the telecom tower. So moving on from the ABC model, we now have a better insight, especially on this visit. I've spoken to a number of minigrid and other private sector power suppliers, and uh, there are a tremendous number of tasks that minigrid operators today are having to undertake on their own, which are not their core business in order to do what it is that they need to be doing. Market information, and a lot of these have to do with information, by the way. So I've listed out some of them here. Market information, data collection, surveys, mapping of load locations, daily fluctuation in demand, all this kind of due diligence and investigation of a site where they would like to set up. So there's a tremendous amount of upfront information gathering. Certainly, they're being helped by some agencies, and IFC has also been involved as well as other partners. But still, right now, the way it is, the mini grid company, or I should say the ESCO, has to pay a lot of attention to this upfront data gathering, which takes time and which is expensive. Another round of information that ESCOs have to go after is the information on latest available technologies to reduce transaction costs. There's all sorts of inventions and innovations going around, like ICT-enabled prepaid smart meters and so forth. But again, this is something that the ESCO has to spend time researching and finding out about, which again takes it away from its core business. There's another whole trove of information to go after, which is potential financing partners, who's going to help with equity, debt, R&D money, who's giving out grant money through, let's say, competitions for social impact ideas. How do I raise money for investment versus how do I raise money for working capital? Again, this is a tremendous amount of transaction costs that they have to go through. Then there's the whole minefield of what is happening in the policy and regulatory environment. Is the government coming up with new incentives? How do I access government grants? What's the paperwork? What kind of reporting formats? If I have donor money, they want to know how my monitoring and evaluation is going. How do I keep on top of that? Uh, and then there's, of course, information on identifying local entrepreneurs if they want to replicate, if they want to migrate their business model from location A to location B, they need to find maybe local entrepreneurs to come and invest in the new location and so forth. So all of these are kind of search costs that when we ask ourselves, why aren't ESCOs scaling up faster than than we observe happening? I think these are a number of barriers and activities that are consuming and diverting their attention based on what I've heard on this visit to India and interviews with a number of such ESCOs. So then we have to ask ourselves, how can third-party supporters of mini-grids help? So we are World Bank, IFC, other foundations, challenge grants, etc., who have interest and resources to help energy access. How can we help? Well, one thing is we can try to reduce transactions costs. All the things that were mentioned in the previous slide, we can be helpful in creating an ecosystem in which ESCOs can thrive by removing some of those burdens so that ESCOs can actually do what ESCOs do best, which is building mini grids and operating and maintaining them. Um, the other thing we found is that there are high quality professional services required by mini grids. Suppose you buy some land and you want to put up some solar panels, you need legal services. You need legal contracts. You need to sign power purchase agreements with your anchor customers. Lots of legal services required. You need accounting services. You need marketing services. You need, to get technical specialists to give you a second opinion on your to give your commercial lender a second opinion on your, to do the appraisal and due diligence on your project design. Lots and lots of professional services that are required. Um, if there were help provided in training them, right now the mini grid operators or the ESCOs practically have to train whoever they speak to and explain their business from top to bottom, um, as to how this works and why they need to be helped. They could do without that. Somebody else could do that for them. Um, Identification of technological inputs, so awareness raising on technology and making the information easily accessible. So this all comes down to the next bullet point, which is mini grid operators or ESCOs can then spend less of their scarce time and hard-earned money chasing up, and I should say chasing up and paying for these services, which effectively reduce their focus on operation and maintenance of their mini grids. So with proper support from us, from the community of supporters of ESCOs, we can increase their bandwidth and allow them to do more in their area of core competence. That's kind of my central point here that I'd like to hear your views on in the discussion. So there are many resources that we are all collectively sitting on to support energy access. How can we resolve the mismatch? We know already that public sector agencies have delivered very limited results. It's difficult for donors to channel funds directly to individual private companies unless we are geared up to do so like IFC. So how can we deliver support just in time? So one idea is for these funds to be invested in creating a common ecosystem for all mini grid operators in a given region or country to lower their transactions costs. Um, One could think of a mini grid development company, actually. I was reminded of, when there was the Global Fund for AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. It doesn't really belong to anyone, but everyone subscribes to it, and it's a common vehicle to direct resources of all kinds to solving a particular problem. So maybe we could think of some sort of a global fund for energy access to reduce transaction costs for a number of its member ESCOs. So this would proactively identify and disseminate market information on unelectrified areas and available technology providers, identify and train a roster of professional service providers for mini grid operators, and it would cost share the payments required for professional services like legal services, accounting services, marketing services, any language translation of contracts, development of model contracts, all sorts of things that could be helpful to mini grid operators and ESCOs. Thank you for your attention.